Let's jump back in time. Way back. The year is 1750. The United States as we know it doesn't exist yet. Instead, you've got 13 British colonies, basically a thin line of settlements clinging to the edge of a massive, unknown continent. So what was it really like to live there? Well, let's find out.
Okay, so really picture it. You're in 1750. No cars, no electricity, no internet, obviously. The land that's going to become this huge nation is just, well, it's a patchwork of very different communities, and they're all ruled by a king who's an entire ocean away. This is colonial America, just about a quarter century before things get revolutionary. It's a world right on the edge of a massive change.
So what's the lay of the land? Well, the 13 colonies are literally squeezed into the East Coast. To the east, you've got the Atlantic Ocean. That's the superhighway for all your trade and news. But to the west, the Appalachian Mountains shoot up like this giant natural wall, which basically kept everyone from pushing much further inland. And since trying to travel over land was a nightmare of dirt paths and thick forests, almost everyone lived right near the coast or along big rivers. It was just easier.
Now, here's something you got to remember. These 13 colonies were not one big happy family. Not at all. They were actually split into 3 very distinct regions, and each one had its own vibe, its own economy, and its own way of life. Let's dig into how the land itself created these 3 totally different worlds.
You can see the huge differences right here in this chart. Up in New England, you had these long, brutal winters and super rocky soil, which made farming a real challenge. So what did they do? They turned to the sea. Fishing, whaling, and building ships became their thing. Then you have the Middle Colonies. Their weather was much milder, the soil was great, and they grew so much grain they were literally nicknamed the breadbasket of the colonies. And way down south, it was hot, it was humid, and that was absolutely perfect for growing hugely valuable crops like tobacco and rice on these massive farms called plantations.
So in New England, most families were doing what's called subsistence farming. That's a key term. It basically means you're growing just enough food to feed your own family, and that's it. There isn't much extra to sell at the market. That rocky soil made it pretty much impossible to have giant, profitable farms, which is exactly why so many New Englanders had to get creative and become masters of the sea.
The Middle Colonies, though, were a completely different story. You can think of them as America's original melting pot. Seriously. You had people coming from England, Germany, the Netherlands, all over the place. They brought their own languages, their own beliefs, their own customs. All this diversity, especially in busy port cities like Philadelphia and New York, made the whole region a lot more tolerant and open than its neighbors.
And that brings us to the engine that powered the entire Southern economy: cash crops. Now, unlike subsistence farming, the whole idea of a cash crop, like tobacco, was to grow a ridiculous amount of it, not for you to eat, but to sell for a massive profit, mostly back to England. This system demanded 2 things: tons of land and a huge amount of labor, which, as we'll see, led directly to the plantation system and its reliance on enslaved people.
So you've got these 3 very different regions, all doing their own thing. It begs the question, right? Who was actually in charge of it all? Well, the answer was simple. Every single colony belonged to the massive British Empire, and you can bet Britain had some very strict rules for how things were supposed to work. The whole economic game was based on one big idea: mercantilism. And the theory was pretty straightforward. Colonies, like the ones in America, existed for one main reason: to make the mother country, Great Britain, rich. It worked like this. The colonies would ship over raw materials, think timber, tobacco, cotton, and in return, they were expected to buy all their finished goods, like tools and fancy clothes, from England. It was basically a one-way street designed to funnel wealth straight back to Britain.
So how did Britain enforce this? With a bunch of laws called the Navigation Acts. And these rules were no joke. They said that the most valuable colonial goods could only be sold to England, period. Even if a merchant could get a way better price selling to, say, France or Spain. As you can imagine, a lot of colonists thought this was completely unfair. So what did they do? They became smugglers, secretly and illegally trading with other countries to get around Britain's rules.
This tension wasn't just in trade, it was baked right into the government. In every colony, you had this constant tug of war. On one side, you had the governor, who was picked by the king and was there to look out for Britain's interests. But on the other side, you had a local assembly, a group of officials who were actually elected by the colonists. And here's the kicker. They passed local laws and, this is crucial, they controlled the money from taxes. This setup gave colonists a real taste of what it felt like to govern themselves.
But let's be really clear about who actually had a voice here. This early taste of democracy was incredibly limited. The right to vote, the right to have any say in your government, that was almost exclusively for white men who owned land. Women, Native Americans, and of course, enslaved people, they had absolutely no political voice at all.
All right, so we've looked at the big picture, the geography, the economics, the government, but what was it actually like to be alive day to day in 1750? Let's zoom in a bit and look at the reality of daily work, family, and where you fit into society. Life was hard. Physically demanding in a way that's tough for us to imagine. Your workday literally started when the sun came up and ended when it went down. Everything was done by hand. Women had this incredible list of jobs, spinning wool into thread, making every piece of clothing, cooking every meal over a fire, preserving all the food to get through the winter. Men were out farming, hunting, or building whatever the family needed. Just surviving took everyone in the family working together, all day, every day.
And society was very rigid, almost like a ladder. At the very top, you had the gentry. These were the super wealthy planters, merchants, and top officials. Below them was a pretty large middle class made up of farmers who owned their own land and skilled craftsmen. Then you had poor white farmers and laborers. Further down were indentured servants, people who were working for several years just to pay off the cost of their trip to America. And at the absolute bottom of this ladder were enslaved Africans, who were legally considered property. They had no rights, and their forced labor was what held up the economy in many parts of the colonies.
So even with all the hard work and these deep social divisions, something new was definitely starting to form. The colonies were growing fast, and even though they were pretty isolated from each other, people and ideas were starting to connect in some really important new ways.
Now, just getting around was a huge pain. The roads were basically terrible dirt tracks, so travel was slow and tough. News traveled just as slowly. A letter from England could take months to show up. But this slow pace had a really interesting side effect. It made local communities super tight-knit, and places like taverns became incredibly important. They weren't just for getting a drink. They were the social hubs, the information centers, where you'd hear the latest news from other towns or even from across the ocean.
And as the population grew, so did the cities. By 1750, you had 4 major urban centers that were the real engines of the colonial world. You had Philadelphia, the biggest and most organized city of them all. There was Boston, the heart of New England's whole shipping empire. You had New York City, already a buzzing, diverse port. And down in the south, you had Charleston, the absolute center for the rice and indigo trade.
So this is where we'll leave it, in 1750. You've got these 13 distinct colonies, all tied to Britain, but all developing their own unique cultures and economies. They have their own social structures, their own booming cities, and they're getting a real taste for making their own rules. And all of this leaves one big question just hanging in the air. What happens next? What happens when these very different groups of people, living an entire ocean away from their king, start to realize they might have more in common with each other than with the empire that's supposed to be in charge?